He-Man and the Masters of the Universe franchise needs little to no introduction. It defined the childhood of most kids from the late 80s and the early 90s with its beautifully crafted setting, colorful and engaging characters, and heroic storylines. While every other studio at that time was subcontracting its animation to studios overseas, He-Man was made completely in-house. It pioneered the first-run syndication, which was a game-changer for shows at the time. The series single-handedly catapulted the franchise and the industry to the next level. However, like all good things, it had to come to an end. The original animated show left a massive vacuum for Mattel, Filmation, and the fans, which everyone wanted to be filled immediately. Still basking in the success of the 1983 show, a series of attempts were made to reboot or expand on the tales of He-Man. However, while we've gotten a number of spin-offs and reboots through the years, there were 4 He-Man stories that never got to see the light of day. So, in this video, we thought we'd take you through these obscure tales and let you be the judge whether that fate was deserved or not. So join us as we travel back to Eternia and rediscover its past that could have defined its future. Let's get right into it. Cancelled live-action He-Man series confirmed by Mark DiCamillo that reimagined the series on Earth. Many newer fans might not know that the upcoming He-Man movie isn't the first live-action film of the franchise. In fact, we actually had a live-action film made all the way back in 1987 starring Dolph Lundgren as He-Man. Depending on who you ask, the film was mostly considered a success. If you were to ask our opinion, having watched it much later on in life, we thought it did a decent job of adapting the franchise to the big screen. Mattel certainly seemed to think so, because no sooner had the film been received by the audiences than they immediately began concocting a project for a live-action He-Man TV show. They intended to plant the He-Man story on Earth instead of Eternia and make some major modifications to the character designs from the original. This was mostly done to keep the budget feasible for a live-action episodic TV show. This meant that the costumes and character designs had to be heavily toned down compared to the cartoon. For example, instead of all the fantastical mounts in the original show, they opted to use real-life vehicles, which were modded to give a fantasy aesthetic. This thought process also bled into the casting, where characters like He-Man and Man-at-Arms were cast, but others like Orko were completely omitted. Instead of the barbarian warrior look, the showrunners decided to go for a more futuristic sci-fi appearance for most characters. At that time, Mattel was leaning heavily towards laser weapons for their characters, and they intended to do the same for this TV show as well. So, as you can imagine, this version of He-Man was nothing like the original shows that most people had grown up with. I mean, heck, they didn't even have Castle Grayskull, as confirmed by Mark DiCamillo, the former director of marketing at Mattel, who was working closely on this project. In fact, many have drawn comparisons of this ill-fated show with another sci-fi series that came out around 1987 called Captain Power. Since this show was based on a toy line by Mattel as well, the comparisons were kind of inevitable. Mark, however, has gone on record since then to clarify that the shows were never related in any form. The series was meant to be a primetime show, as that was the only way something of its nature could justify its budget. In the end, the financial constraints to create a He-Man show that actually could be at least somewhat faithful to the original IP were deemed not worth the risk. Mattel most likely saw that it would lose money over the show while alienating fans at the same time with this shoddy attempt. Eventually, it was scrapped, with many of the ideas being carried over to future shows in the franchise. I'm not gonna lie, unlike the other cancelled shows that we're gonna discuss today, there certainly won't be any sleep lost over this one, at least not on our end.
By the power of Grayskull!
He-Man and the Masters of Space, 1988 to 89. Filmation's own replacement show that they never got to make. Towards the late 80s, as the original series had run its course, Mattel wanted something new to appeal to the emerging generation of the 90s. Filmation felt the need for a reboot as well and was eager to replicate their success with the original show. Mattel was looking for someone to develop what they called the New Adventure series, which was meant to be an animated series that reinvented and expanded on the He-Man mythos. Lou Scheimer and his team at Filmation obviously decided to put their own pitch forward. He-Man is a unique blend of a medieval fantasy setting with sci-fi elements attached to it. Filmation pitched a story that, while expanding on the lore, leaned heavily on the sci-fi elements. Scheimer pitched a bold idea where Eternia was a part of a much larger cosmic structure that had numerous other similar planets. The change that we found the hardest to reconcile, however, was the fact that Scheimer decided to change Grayskull from this mystical font of power to a mere house for a spaceship called Eternia, which was the actual power source. It threatened to destroy all the cool mythos and mystery that fans had built up over the years in an instant regarding a key concept of the original series. They also intended to send He-Man across the universe, fighting threats on other alien worlds, and, no pun intended, this seems wildly outlandish. They also introduced new villains in the form of Skeletor's sister and nephews, named Skeletrix, Funnybone, and Honeybone, respectively. You can see Filmation's attempts to diverge from the more serious storytelling towards something more campy, but unfortunately for them, Mattel decided to completely ignore their pitch and handed the development of the new show to another studio called Jetlag Productions instead. No one has really come out on record to state why they did that. If you look at things like the relationship between the two corporations and the financial state of Mattel at the time, you can read between the lines. It felt like a true betrayal to Filmation and their fans, because without them, the He-Man series would never have gained the popularity it did. Not to forget, once again, the resources that they had poured into its success over the years. For Mattel to entirely pass them up left a sour taste in the mouths of many people. It certainly left us feeling sorry for the folks at Filmation when we found out about it much later. Unfortunately for Filmation, despite their contribution to the growth of this legacy franchise, they were booted to the curb in the end. He-Ro, son of He-Man, the 1988 pitch that sat in Mattel's vault for 26 years. The years after the failed pitch by Filmation continued to see numerous other attempts to advance the He-Man series to the next generation. There was apparently a lot of work being done behind the scenes at Mattel as well to make sure that this came into fruition. Then, PowerCon/Power Party happened in 2014, and a massive reveal was made by Scott Neatlick, who worked as Mattel's brand manager at the time during the event. We found out that a Bible for a Son of He-Man animated series had been lying in their vault since 1988. We're not talking about fan theories and rumors here. This had come directly from the horse's mouth. According to this Bible, He-Man is no longer the central protagonist. Instead, he passed the torch to his son, who inherited the power sword and goes by the name He-Ro. His mother in this story is Teela, and we're told that he was sent away in a rocket ship by his parents to a distant planet called Primus due to a dire crisis threatening Eternia. Once on Primus, he's raised by Darius to be a virtuous and righteous man just like his father. However, even in this world, evil still lurks, which is compounded by the presence of Skeletine. And no points for guessing who Skeletine is the son of. Of course, this is Skeletor's progeny, whom he sired with Evil Lyn, or the Shadow Weaver, depending on the version of the story. You need to understand that while Mattel did reveal the Bible for this story, they were frustratingly close-handed when it came to revealing the actual plot in detail. This is why we don't know the true origin of Skeletine or how he even ends up crossing paths with He-Ro. What we did discover during the research for this video is that it seems to have influenced Lou Scheimer's final pitch later down the line. It's also important to note that He-Man, as a TV franchise, had not been completely abandoned during this fallow period. He-Ro, son of He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, 1996, Lou Scheimer's last attempt. In the early 90s, Lou Scheimer and his daughter would launch their own animation studio called Lou Scheimer Productions. Thanks to his prior history with the franchise, Scheimer would attempt to pitch a fresh idea for continuing the tale of this iconic franchise. Even though this pitch sadly never materialized into something substantial, and there's limited information about it out there, we still think it's worth discussing here. In Scheimer's He-Ro, son of He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, Eternia has been freed from the terror of Skeletor, and Adam has emerged victorious. Even though Skeletor is defeated, his shadow looms ominously in the background of this newfound peace that Eternia enjoys under their ruler, King Adam, and his wife, Queen Teela. Some 10 years pass in this manner, when Adam finds a feral child whom he names Dare. He's been raised by a she-bear-cat all this time in the wilderness and only has a bird named Craven as a companion. Taken in by the royal family, Dare starts off as a socially awkward child who eventually blossoms into a wonderful young man, embodying the virtues of his adoptive parents. This sort of power passes on to him, and with it, he gains the power to continue He-Man's legacy as He-Ro, the new guardian of Eternia. The character of He-Ro here is not to be confused with the similarly named son of Adam and Teela that featured in other versions of the show. His faithful companion Craven transforms into his steed Cringer, and together they fight to preserve the peace that his father fought for. However, He-Man's old nemesis Skeletor seems to be back, And now, the inexperienced hero must find a way to combat this ancient evil that even his father struggled against. Honestly, in our opinion, out of all the failed concepts that we've spoken about, this one seemed like a genuine missed opportunity. I felt that this concept remained true to the original series in its narrative focus, while telling the story of a new generation of heroes in a way that doesn't diminish the overall lore. It should be noted that the hero action figures that Mattel developed towards the end of the Masters of the Universe series seem to be completely unrelated to Scheimer's characters. For one, the figures were never released publicly, and Scheimer never came out and said that he heard of the figures before that. At this point, we suggest you take this coincidence with a grain of salt like we did. Regardless, this would be the final pitch made by Scheimer, as Deke Studios would completely reject his script. Despite these failures, the He-Man franchise has seen reboots and continuations of the story since then. She-Ra, Princess of Power, which was a spin-off of He-Man with a female lead, was a resounding success. Jetlag Productions, which was favored over Filmation, also ended up producing their own series called The New Adventures of He-Man. In this version, it's He-Man who ends up on Primus and leads a new band of companions against the evils of Skeletor, who of course followed him. More recently, Netflix came out with Masters of the Universe Revelation in 2020, which was meant to be a direct sequel to the original shows. We also have the upcoming live-action film, meaning that despite these failures to reboot or reinvent the story, the He-Man franchise is still alive and flourishing almost 4 decades later. Let us know your favorite Masters of the Universe character in the comments down below, but for now, it's time for me to say goodbye. We hope to see you soon in the next one, but until then, stay safe,